All right. Go ahead and get the party started then. So, good day and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the Accommodations Blueprint with Rebecca.prejean, brought to you by Insignia Training Partners. So, if you don't know me, my name is Bernie DeSantis. I'm the owner and CEO of Insignia Training Partners. We are a training broker. What we do is we connect organizations with the right talent, content, and resources in order to design, develop, and deploy training courses, programs, and virtual events that don't suck. So I will be your producer today. And if you do run into any technical challenges with Zoom, please feel free to reach out to me directly in the chat. I'll also drop my contact information into the chat here if you'd like to connect with me and explore doing a virtual event of your own at some point. Now, we do intend for this to be an interactive and engaging event, so please do drop your comments into the chat. If you have any questions, please drop those in as well, and we'll do our best to weave them into the conversation, or we'll address them towards the end of our event today. Please be sure to participate in the polling and chat activities as we proceed. And lastly, please be advised that our event is being recorded. So with those logistics out of the way, let me introduce you to our speaker. So Rebecca is the CEO and founder of EB Graphics and Consulting, specializing in instructional design, multimedia production, and accessibility-focused experiences. She has over a decade of expertise and has become a leading advocate for accessibility in corporate environments, particularly focusing on creating supportive spaces for neurodivergent employees with autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. Her passion for driving positive change in the learning and development industry has led her to work with Fortune 500 companies, where she applies her skills to craft immersive experiences for diverse audiences. As a thought leader in accessibility-focused learning, Rebecca is dedicated to empowering individuals through innovative and inclusive educational practices. She collaborates with organizations to develop and implement company-wide strategies and policies for neurodivergent individuals. So with that, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bernie. That was such a mouthful, but an awesome mouthful. I'm so glad that everybody made the time to be here. And as Bernie mentioned, my name is Rebecca, and I'm an accessibility consultant and a multimedia designer. So I combine all of these things to bridge the gap between accessibility and success in business. And so today, what we're going to do is dive into accommodations, right? We've all heard about them. They're big talk right now, especially with all the virtual and hybrid things that are going on. And so firsthand, I've seen the impact that it can have when people have what they need to support them versus what happens when they don't. And so we're going to go into a practical approach on how you can make accommodations work in your workplace without all the extra guesswork, the frustration, and the unnecessary red tape that tends to come around with it. And that brings us to the question of the day. Why are we actually here? Why are you sitting in this virtual meeting? Why are you making the time? Why does this even matter? Because to some people, they don't really know. But before we even get into the nitty gritty of the stuff, real quick in the chat, I want you to answer the question, what's the biggest misconception you've heard about workplace accommodations? Can be in your particular workplace, can be something that you've heard, but I want to know, what's the biggest misconception that you've heard about workplace accommodations? They are costly. That is a popular thing that I hear. What other things? They're not fair to others. So some people feel left out. You have to accommodate everything no matter what. Like there's no parameters, right? All of these things are rooted in just, yes, there's special use cases that are important. There's all these things, right? And a lot of it is not completely false. I won't say that, but definitely misconceptions around it. And so today, that's why we're here. We're going to talk about all of this confusion. We're going to clear that up. We're going to break down what's required of businesses. We're going to talk about how accommodations can actually help in multiple areas of business, not just human resources, because they're not the only ones that have that responsibility or that obligation to people. And we're going to show how the right approach can actually benefit everybody in business, because ultimately we all like working, we all have jobs, and we want everybody to be able to succeed. And if you're a business owner in particular, or, kind of head of HR or anything, you want your business, who you work for, to actually succeed. And so that's what we're going to get into today. Now, by the end of all of this, some key objectives, some things I want you to take. I want you to be able to identify the key components of workplace accommodations and their impact on business. I want you to be able, hold on one moment, real quick. Here we go. Thumbs up if you can now see my screen. Awesome. It was sounding really good though. So I also want you to be able to analyze, real world accommodations cases, determine what works, what doesn't work, and how you can actually move forward. I want you to be able to evaluate the difference between reasonable and unreasonable accommodations. And I want you to be able to develop an actionable accommodations blueprint of your own. Ultimately, I'm sharing this information so that you can take it and make it your own. It doesn't have to look exactly like I presented to you. This is like a good foundation, right? We want you to have something to build on. And so with no further ado, let's go into the foundation of accommodations. What are they and how do they actually impact the business? Also, just so y'all know, like Bernie said, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them throughout. I look at the chat, so we won't ignore you. But by definition, workplace accommodations are just modifications that enable employees with disabilities to perform their essential job duties. Lots of words to simply say they are the things that remove barriers that actually prevent people from doing the job that they need to do and from being successful. In a nutshell, that's what workplace accommodations are. They are support. They are not exceptions. They're not coddling. They're not special gifts that we give people in business, to do whatever. They really are a support system for people. And they can come in different forms. So primary types that you'll see are things like adjusted schedules. You'll see assistive technology. So I want you to think like screen readers, additional communication devices. You'll see workplace modifications, like ergonomic things, maybe standing desks. And you'll also see job task adjustments. And that can be something as simple as presenting written instructions as opposed to having a bunch of verbal conversation in meetings. Yes, some people actually do consider eyeglasses to be disability accommodations. There's a lot going on in the accommodations world. So what's the impact of these accommodations? Good things, right? It impacts employees and it impacts businesses in a very good, positive way. For employees, I want you to think about all the people that we talk about that are quiet quitting, right? Those folks, they're just kind of left out in the wind. Things like accommodations may not hit all of them, but it can help some of them because it improves job satisfaction, it improves morale, it improves productivity, engagement, reduces that burnout and absenteeism. So people don't want to necessarily leave, right? And that's an actual boost for businesses because it boosts retention. It reduces all that turnover. People aren't quietly quitting if they feel seen, have what they need, and can actually get the job done and feel good about it at the end of the day. It also strengthens company culture. People talk about workplace culture all the time, but yet they don't accommodate anything. The two do go hand in hand, and you really do have to have both of them to work. It also drives innovation and problem solving. We're talking about AI a lot lately. People are like, I want to be on the forefront of AI and technology, but they don't do any accommodations for their people or support them. When you do those things, when you accommodate people, when you support them in the way they need to be supported, you'll get your innovation because they no longer have to expend that bandwidth to just survive. They can now use that same energy that they were using to survive in your culture to actually think of new things, think of new ways to actually interact with product, think of new ways to interact with customers. So all in all, it's positive when we go into the world of accommodations and helping people succeed. Now, with all this positivity, I'm going to rain on the parade a little bit. I don't think I have to tell people in this room that the current state of accommodations is fairly abysmal, right? You don't see a lot of people getting what they need. Like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of misconceptions there, but numbers also don't lie. So approximately 22.8% of working age adults could benefit from accommodations. However, between 47 and 58% of people aren't actually even receiving them, even after they've requested them. Could be for a myriad of reasons, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But I want you to think about that. If almost a quarter of your workforce can benefit from accommodations, but you're not even talking to them, you're not giving it to them, I don't really know what you expect to happen other than failure and struggle in, business problems. 43% of employees that request accommodations still fear that negative stigmatization that comes up. In the world that we live in today, it is much more accepting of disabilities. However, when people start asking for support, they start being looked at as a burden. And nobody wants to be looked at that way when they're at work, when they're trying to do what they're supposed to do, what they need to do to survive and have their livelihood, right? So that's going to automatically stop them from asking for accommodations and therefore being successful. And I want you to consider this last little piece of information and put it in perspective of your own workplace and the people that you know and the businesses that you may interact with. Approximately 25% of employees self-identify as having a disability. That's not the folks that have it, right? There's more, but these are the people who are willing to self-identify. However, most companies really believe that only 4 to 7% of their workforce has a disability. So right there, you have a lot of dissonance. If I don't believe that these people are in my workforce, it doesn't really motivate me to do this extra thing because I'm not thinking that there's a lot of people that even need this. Possibly an ethical, moral problem there, but that's kind of what dissonance is, right? So as you think about the people that you interact with, the departments that you interact with, all of those things, I want you to accept and just digest how many people are just not believed that they actually have a disability and how that puts up a barrier to even getting to the accommodations that they need, right? So let's talk about the legal side of accommodations. As somebody said a little earlier, people are just out here doing whatever they want with accommodations, not giving it, just saying, well, we have to do it all, no matter what it is, and none of that is true. So before we go forward, though, quick little poll. Some of y'all already know the answer because I remember talking to you. But how many employees must the company have before it is legally required to provide accommodations? You have 4 options: 3, 15, 50, or 100. We'll give y'all a couple minutes. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think we got most in.
I'll close it out in 3, 2, and 1. Results are on screen.
It's actually a tie between 3 and 15. Sadly, even though I would like it to be 3, the correct answer is 15. So I guess you could say in most of our thought processes, we're like, well, if you have any employees, you should probably be doing this. But legally, it's 15. Now, I want you to also consider a lot of companies get thrown off a little bit because as opposed to thinking, well, if we have 1 employee or even 15, we have to have accommodations, they're thinking it's larger. So they're thinking the 50, 100, that's when we get into, compliance and all of these things. None of that is true. So what we're going to talk about is just kind of the legalities of it. What are businesses responsible for and what are the consequences when they don't actually do these things? Now, again, ethically, morally, truly believe people should be doing this. However, there is a legal side to it, and I do think we need to have those conversations to really understand how to drive the rest of the change that we're looking for. So getting down to the legal framework, I want you to focus on 3 regulations in particular. Some may have heard of them, some may not have, but we're going to talk about them real quick. So the first one is ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. I want to say enacted in 1992 by George H.W. Bush at the time. And really what that focuses on is requiring, private employers with 15 plus employees to provide reasonable accommodations unless they cause undue hardship. We'll talk about undue hardship in a moment because a lot of people throw that phrase around, and I want to make sure that we understand what that actually means. Then you have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That was actually enacted in 1973. You see this one a lot more when you get into schools. Primarily, you'll probably hear about it. My son Ethan has autism. He has a 504 plan. So his accommodations are given through this particular section, but it applies to federally funded programs, including government agencies, public schools, and federal contractors. So another misconception that comes up a lot is that, well, I just use a bunch of contractors. So I don't have to pay attention to accommodations, ADA, none of those things apply to me. Not true. Section 504 still covers federal contractors. Now, 1099 contractors, freelance contractors, they are not covered under any of these regulations. However, there are local and state statutes, depending on where you live, that could cover them. So it's always a good thing to kind of know and be aware of as you're hiring and doing all the things. But Section 508 requires federal agencies to make their digital and IT resources accessible. So that can be software, that can be PDFs that you'll find. I know we're all thinking about taxes right now because taxes are the thing. And we're in the middle of tax season, right? If you were to go on the IRS's website, look at any of their resources, their videos, all of those things, it should be accessible. So it should be following, web accessibility guidelines and all of that under Section 508. Getting into what is legally covered. I love this conversation the most because, as somebody else pointed out earlier, you get into the weird, wacky world of people's imaginations, misconceptions. It's always a crazy ball of yarn to untangle. But I want you to break it down into just general accommodations and things that are kind of considered slightly over the top, right? Yeah. I just caught Denise's comment. Yeah. Schools and universities can do a lot of things with ADA and Section 504. It can be quite a mess, guys. But in terms of what's legally covered, I want you to think ergonomic equipment, standing desks, special chairs, ergonomic keyboards, that would be covered. Remote work is also covered as an accommodation. Now, there are some caveats to that. Somebody can't just come up to you and say, I want to work remotely, and their primary responsibilities are all in person. Like, it doesn't quite work that way. There has to be some collaboration, but technically, that is an accommodation that would be, considered completely reasonable in most cases. Screen reader software, tons of screen readers that are out there. Guess what? If somebody says, I need a screen reader for my job, that would be covered. And that would be something that you would have to talk about. Alternative task management, Microsoft, Google Drive, all of those things. Some people have like add-ons that you can purchase. Those are things that are covered. In terms of like legalities, what you can ask, what you can require of your employees to kind of prove that they need these things. I'm actually going to give you a resource on that. And more information will come on that later. But I want you to start thinking these are things that, again, are legally covered. So these are things, if you fall in the category of having to give accommodations, that you have to give with caveats and different things. Yes. So I want you to think different ways of management, right? And it really can be as simple as a calendar app that maybe the company doesn't have. It can be a different process because I know a lot of people like spreadsheets. I personally hate spreadsheets. If you put a spreadsheet in front of me, I'm going to lose my mind because it's just too much for me to focus on at any given time. So you can maybe have something outside of a spreadsheet. I also have had people who I've worked for that wanted me to tick off different boxes for task management. I failed at that abysmally because I just could not deal with that process for whatever reason. It was hard for me. So maybe instead of the check boxes and the spreadsheets, I just send an email, right? There's different ways that you can manage tasks that don't have to be a lot. Jira, all these different things where you move the task to this, you move the task to that. It seems really simplistic, but for someone like myself, I could never handle it. And it looked like I wasn't doing work until I produced something, but I was doing work the whole time. I just could not remember to go in and switch this to this and this to that. So it's finding another way to make that process happen while still holding them accountable. Oh, you're absolutely welcome. Like I said, guys, feel free to put anything in. But not covered would be things like personal equipment, wheelchairs, hearing aids, eliminating essential job functions, lowering job performance standards. Those kinds of things would not be covered, if that makes sense. let's talk about undue hardship. In the chat, when you hear that term, undue hardship, what comes to your mind? Like, what do you think that would encompass? Okay. Making disability worse, business can't function, not a financial hardship, company would risk losing. Yeah, at an elevate. Yeah, like excessive costs is typically the way that this is positioned. But when we say excessive, that can be relative, right? Because what I think is excessive may not be, if I'm buying Gucci bags every day, somebody else might think that's excessive, but I'm like, but that's how we're living over here, kind of thing. So when we say that, it can be really, relative to who's being talked to. But I want you to think really overburdening. So things like excessive costs, shifting core responsibilities to others, altering a job's fundamental purpose, creating a completely different role for the individual. Those would be things that define an undue hardship under the law. Lowering performance standards is also something. And when we talk about lowering performance standards, some people, kind of ask me, what does that mean? And when I say lowering performance standards, I want you to think of it this way. Every business has its own standard, right? Whether you're creative, whatever, every business has its standard that it wants to put out in terms of quality, value to the customer, that kind of thing. The standard itself, every business is allowed to have that. The process to get to that standard, however, can be modified. So it's never moving the goalpost. It's never you have to no longer do or achieve like the number of sales that somebody else does. It's making sure that the process is what can be modified. So if they're asking, let's say a call center, because I used to work in those and I'm comfortable with them. So let's say one of the call center metrics was answering 40 calls per day, whatever. And the person says, well, I only want to answer 20. That would be considered an undue hardship because it's lowering a performance standard. Now, we would then need to ask why, do you feel like you can only answer 20? What's going on there? And sometimes it can just be, I need a break. I'm overwhelmed. I'm, dysregulated. There's too much sensory processing going on. And those are things that we can address, right? But when people start throwing this term around and denying accommodations because of it, we need to be very, very clear about what this means. You are still required as a business to legally review and explore cost-effective measures. So like somebody said earlier, I need you to add an entire elevator to this building. Granted, if they don't already have that, that's a problem all in itself. That is for another webinar and another day. But it's like they may not be able to ask for that specific accommodation, right off the bat. We might have to actually work at some other things that are alternatives. So maybe instead of rewiring the building, we talk about getting a ramp, or we talk about building a lift. Something that maybe isn't as cost heavy, but still actually accommodates the person. And the consequences when people don't do what they're supposed to do are heavy, folks. I will tell you now, I have worked with some clients. They usually come to me once a lawsuit is pending, and some other things are happening. And you start to really see how hoping and praying that people just go away or don't say anything is really not an efficient way of handling any of this, because you can get EEOC complaints and investigations. You can have disability discrimination lawsuits, and that can be internal and external. In some cases, Target got sued. It's been about 4 or 5 years at this point, I think, maybe a little bit more, but they got sued for $6 million because their website wasn't accessible. And they lost that. So they had to pay to retrofit their website, and they had to pay the settlement. Fines and penalties. We're talking your first violation is up to $75,000. The subsequent violations can be up to $150,000. It can be costly for businesses to not do these things, but additionally, there's reputational damage. And that does not go away. people in this community, the disability community, all of those folks. Oh, Target or Target, depending on who you're talking to. But these things don't go away on their own at all. Once you have been put out there as somebody who doesn't care about disabled people, that doesn't go away. And you will forever lose any kind of staying power or business power or buying power in this community. That doesn't go away that easy. Cracker Barrel was one earlier this year, denied a busload of kids access to one of their restaurants. Like, people protested about that, and I'm telling you now, in the forums that I'm in, people still actively say, don't go to Cracker Barrel. And these aren't people just from my local area, these are people from all over. So the reputational damage can almost be just as bad as the financial damage. So, quick question for everybody. Does your organization have a clear process for workplace accommodations? There's several options, of course. Yes, it's well defined and effective. Somewhat, no, or I'm not sure. All completely valid, by the way. Got them rolling in.
Give it
We've
another
got
5 seconds. 3, 2, and 1. Your results are on screen.
all right. So it looks like most of us say somewhat, but it could be clearer. And that's pretty accurate. Like, you have some kind of version of an accommodations plan at your workplace, because legally you have to have it. But if you start digging into who's responsible for this, who's responsible for that, who do I ask, what can I ask for, those are the things that are really murky, right? And usually people are having, usually people are only having this huge handbook or whatnot, this policy book from HR. It's usually available online through like an intranet or something, but it's like 700 pages. And so people are like, I don't even know the first place to look for an accommodations plan. And so even though somebody might have it, it's not even useful because nobody can access it, nobody can really find it. And so they're just going to struggle. Equally, they don't always know what they can ask for. And so as we're going into how you can build your blueprint, I want you to think about this again as a way to make it your own and how you can build something that actually works. And I've said it to several people over the last couple of weeks. Yes, I speak a lot to human resources, but this is something for my learning and development people, my marketing people. You can actually still have the same process because we deal with people who need accommodations in some way, shape, or form, and we should have a way for them to request it and get what they need, especially if you're in learning and development. So how do you build access? You'll notice it's ACCESS. That's an actual acronym and process I've come up with for my clients. I like a good acronym. It's easy for me to remember. It's just foolproof most of the time for me. So assess the gaps, clarify responsibilities, create a standardized process, educate and train, streamline implementation, and then sustain and improve. So what this really is based on is how to go from, if you have absolutely nothing or, kind of a semblance of something, to something that is full-blown effective and can be sustainable and improvable over time. Breaking it down a little bit more, and Bernie, if you can put that PDF resource in there, that would be helpful, because I know this is a lot to look at. So I did break it down in bullet points on the resource that Bernie's about to give us in just a second. But if we want to kind of just go down into some nitty gritty, I want you to think of assessing the gaps as being very honest with yourself, with your department, and with your business. Do you have anything? If you don't have anything, what should you be having? If you have something, where are the gaps? Are people even using your process? Who's in charge of what? Really kind of getting down into a very uncomfortable space for yourself and asking, where are we dropping the ball? Does HR even know of legal obligations? Like, where are we? And I've had clients say, this doesn't feel very good and I don't want to do it anymore because they feel bad about it. But at the end of the day, it's like you have to understand where you're at to get to a better spot. That's just reality. Step 2, clarifying responsibilities. So defining who is responsible for what. Who is responsible for handling requests going forward, and it's going to ensure accountability. So I want you to think of this as who's going to oversee compliance. Maybe it's HR. Then managers may handle day-to-day accommodations, and requests, but making sure leadership supports the initiative and then employees know where to go for assistance. That's what this is. It's really just mapping out who's going to do what in my process. And then you're going to create some standardization because we all like a good standardized process. That's what business is all about, right? Rinse, wash, repeat. So you're going to develop something that's clear and repeatable. And this is where you're going to outline those step-by-step procedures. You're going to do it for employees to request their accommodations, for HR to evaluate them, and for managers to implement solutions. Because it doesn't just stop with, well, HR approved it, right? And here, employee, here's your thing. Managers also have to be able to implement these things. And so you have to think not just on the front side, you have to think on the back side of what that's going to look like. So it can actually be creating simple request forms, documentation guidelines. Oh, wow, Tony, that's a lot. For those that might have missed it, he met with a client today that said they just don't hire blind people. That is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Just so they're aware, that is a lot. And guess what? The sadder part is there's a way to fix that with accommodations and making sure things are eligible for screen readers. That is rough right there. But yeah, creating a process, you can create simple request forms, documentation guidelines, and timelines for response. I cannot tell you how many people will tell me, well, we have a process. Great. What does it look like? They request it and then HR looks at it. Okay, how long does that take? I don't know. It could take like a week, it could take 2 weeks. But like one took like a month, and you're just like, it sounds like you have no idea how long these things should take. You're just kind of winging it. And that's going to be a problem. So that you need to have some timelines for response, back and forth. Collaboration is always the key. And then you'll move on into education and training, not just training HR about legal responsibilities and forms and all of these things. You also need to train your employees, including your managers. So you do need to train and educate your employees about what these accommodations can look like, talk to them about what is considered reasonable, what's considered unreasonable, and actually really have a conversation with them. You need them to know their rights. I know some companies are just like, well, we're just going to keep you over here in the dark, but nothing good comes of that whatsoever. Because then if you happen to find yourself in a place where somebody's auditing you or looking into things and you've just let people run around just however, you can get into some trouble. So it's about training HR. It's about training your managers about how to actually have conversations with people and have good soft people skills to be collaborative and be kind and compassionate. It's about training your employees the right way. It's about doing all of those things. When you get into implementation, my favorite part, digitize everything, folks. Don't do any kind of paper. The trees will thank you. But what I normally do for folks is I do develop kind of an intranet webpage if they have that available to them. If not, there's some different pieces of software and things that can help us with that. Some people are like, well, we don't have any of it. So we end up in a spreadsheet, my favorite place. Whatever the case may be, we need to digitize the forms so they're easily accessible, fillable as PDFs, create a dedicated space for these requests to go, create templates for common accommodations, things that you know people will request. Go ahead and create a template for it. And then, like I said, create a follow-up as well, a follow-up process for people to check in and be like, hey, I haven't heard back from blah, 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 blah. And actually having a process around that to make sure people get what they need. And of course, sustainability and improvement, right? Once you have everything together, It's all just about sustaining. And what I like for people to do is check in with the people who have requested accommodations, see if that stuff is working for them. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn out conversation. It doesn't have to be uncomfortable. It's like, hey, how's that working for you? If it's not working well, they're not going to be able to do their work. So it's like check in with them, see how that's going, see if there needs to be some adjustments. Take that feedback that they give you and learn how to do it better in the future. I usually tell folks revisit it every 6 to 8 months. It doesn't need to be something that you revisit every single day, every single week, nothing of that sort. If you've done the legwork, you can revisit it, you know, every 6 months or so and see how that goes. Get some focus groups going. But if you also create a culture where people feel seen, they feel validated, they feel comfortable, they'll come to you anyway. Between the 6 to 8 months, they'll let you know, hey, this isn't working for me. Can we try this? Right. So part of this is all building a culture where people can actually come through and say, hey, I need this support without feeling that stigmatization we talked about earlier. Now, as much as we would love to believe that everything is rosy all the time, there are always complicated requests that come through. Somebody mentioned earlier perceived unfairness, right? And that does happen because not everybody knows everyone else's struggles or their lives. And so they see somebody getting something and they're like, but I want that. I want that. It should be me. Absolutely happens and can definitely happen when you have to handle things that are a little bit more complex. So think about things that require major job modifications, multiple employees requesting accommodations at once, situations where accommodations may not seem reasonable and need further exploration. Those are moments where those can get tricky. On a personal note, I've seen a few different things, and I want you to kind of roll with me for a minute and think about how these can be tricky, but how collaboration can change the narrative, right? Like I've actually seen an employee, they had PTSD and extreme anxiety, but they wanted to work 100% remotely. Kind of mentioned this earlier, right? But their job involved a lot of in-client meetings. Like their clients were like, we don't want to do a bunch of Zoom. We want to be in person, especially post-COVID. And this is what we want, right? We want the team collaboration. And that's valid. They're allowed to want that. On the other hand, what do we say is covered? Remote work. So you do have some dissonance there. What we ended up doing for that employee was saying, okay, I hear this, I hear that need. Let's talk about how we can make this work. So maybe we do more of a hybrid where you only come into office 1 day a week, and those are your client days. So the PTSD, because it was PTSD from like a car accident. So obviously, if that's your PTSD trigger, that is going to be hard to drive to work every day and then kind of, do the in-person meetings. But it's like, how about we have you do it one day a week? You're here for 4 hours, all your client meetings, and then you go home. They were fine with that. She are neurodivergent. In terms of what? So people who are neurodivergent, which is usually kind of my place. I have had people, and I was going to mention something, Tony, so you beat me to it. But I've had an autistic employee before, sensory overload. Like it was very hard for them to be in the office. It was very difficult for them to really hear the sounds. Noise canceling headphones really weren't doing it for them. But what they asked us for was an office. So instead of just like headphones or anything, they're like, can I have my own office? Which I hear and I understand because they can control that better, right? I can put blinds down. I can really have some differences there. We can't give you an office. Technically, that would fall under some unreasonable expectations, stuff like that. So what we did instead, there was an extra office that was around. We can't give you your own office, but we created like a mood room is what I would call it. So we did have kind of more of their preferences, like the soft lighting, allowed them to have a break for a little bit, and they were allowed to take those sensory breaks that they need. As somebody whose son is autistic, sensory breaks are very big to me. Like people need them. My son runs around, he needs that stuff. And so we ended up, we spent a pretty decent amount, but we ended up purchasing some special chairs that he wanted. Other employees were involved in it as well. And so multiple people ended up using it. And it really actually benefited more than just him. Back in my older days, I worked in a call center and they had what we called a quiet room. This was in 2002. So people weren't really thinking about it in the same way. But I look at it now, it was really just a sensory break room and it worked magic. So before I go into anything else, what other questions do you guys have? What else do you want to know? All the things. Or do you have any more questions? None? Am I that good?
Mhm.
Like, happy to take the credit for whatnot.
All right.
Yes.
Denise has got a question.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay,
Mhm.
thanks. So Rebecca,
Hey.
we've had conversations, you know how I feel about you. Um, my experience has been that universities, colleges, schools who say, yes, we want you, they have the facilities, they have the staff. But once that student gets into that university, gets into that school, everything shifts to, oh no, we can't accommodate you. They either don't want to, they don't want to be bothered, they know they'll get a paycheck, even if they don't provide accommodations. My daughter, as I expressed to you, is a senior at Northern Arizona University. They have two buildings. They have disabilities and disabilities resource center and equities and access. And I have my own story about why those buildings are there. But the bottom line is that these universities know they can blow through AGA. They know they can blow through 504. They know they can blow through 509. It doesn't matter because they all have deep pockets and they know that parents would rather either deal with what they have or remove themselves from that environment and go somewhere else, and that institution will keep on existing. There are a lot of companies, as you know, have very deep pockets. Lawsuits take years. It's exhausting. It's exhausting, really. And it's like, okay, you need to be removed from this university. No, I want to stay because I belong here and this is the school I chose. And I'm going to hold everybody accountable. And I'm going to advocate as a student. I'm going to advocate for myself and other kids. So it's just, and now with what's going on in the political environment, it makes it a lot more challenging because, as you know, now it's like, okay, now the president doesn't, the president doesn't care, so why should we care? And it makes it that much harder. So I think this is a great presentation. I love your success stories and I love the information you're providing. And yet when I sit here, this is all great and we want to give companies a new way of looking at things, and I could go in and talk to companies as well and say that, look, that I don't want to say disabilities population, but there are people who say we are disabled and we own that, want to work, want to be of value and want to be of service. They don't want to go the extra mile if they have someone else who doesn't require all this additional work. Okay. What do you say to those who are struggling with lack of integrity, the lack of a moral compass? I don't mean to ramble. I hope I'm clear.
No, you're completely clear. And I think it's because, we're just going to be real for a second. We all know that that exists. Like, this is not a space where everybody has the morals and the ethics to want to do these things. However, that's when I tell people sometimes it's not going to be about morals and ethics that win you the victory. Sometimes it is going to be about actually talking about what they care about. And sometimes that's going to be some research on our part. And it is a struggle. I don't lie to you. I struggle often. I hunt for clients. I actually have to really fight sometimes to get through the door and get what I want. It's all about changing the positioning. And I know a lot of us are like, well, I shouldn't have to. I don't want to. It's exhausting. It is tiring. I hear you. For us to be able to move forward, though, we do have to start listening to what that person is saying. People are going to have deep pockets. Y'all, that ain't changing. Like big business have deep pockets. Like that's not changing at all. And that's reality. However, everybody has a selling point. That is real.
Oh, I agree
It's
with you.
about figuring out what that selling point is. And sometimes it's not going to be to the, well, you should care about this or you should care about that. It can be, well, I see that you're having this problem, or I've noticed that you're having this, and this is costing you this. If we know they care about money, talk about the money. That's probably how I get the majority of my clients.
I agree with you.
Like it sounds very unsavory because we know that there's a people quotient here, but everybody has a selling point. It's about figuring out what that selling point is. But I believe me, and please know I hear you. We've had conversations. So you
I
know
know.
I love you.
Which is why I just felt like I have to. Thank you, Karishma. I had to put it out there because I have had that conversation with, okay, you're in a position of power. What's important to you? What's important to you being in this position? And basically it's, hey, I know I can get a paycheck and I'll, it goes back to they're going to get paid anyway. But I totally agree with you. I've shown, I've used my skills. I've used my negotiation skills. I'm just keeping it real here. Just my experiences. And I agree with you. Like we're aligned in how we speak to people.
Love
So
it
thank
though.
you.
Always welcome. What other questions do we have, Bernie?
Yeah, Rebecca, we had a couple pop into the chat. Creedy asked, can we go more into neurodivergent examples like ADHD and dyslexia?
Yes. So I have had some of those experiences as well. And what I will say generally is this, it does depend because we all know that those can be very varying, experiences. For some of my folks that I've encountered that are dyslexic, they tend to want a lot of things spoken to them, which is perfectly fine. So it's about purchasing possibly speech, text to speech software, all of those kinds of things. And in terms of ADHD, I mean, that is a gamut of options that you come up with. Usually, though, a lot of that, to be honest, falls a lot on the manager because the manager has a process in place that is extremely tedious. And folks that have ADHD cannot handle that whatsoever. It's like kind of, I mentioned like the Jira boards and even the Miro things, like the things that are out there. So taking them out of that and be like, hey, what's going to make the most sense for you? Is it just writing an email? Is it just sending me a Google Doc? Is it tracking on that? Those can get very tricky because it really does depend on the individual. But I've had several of those where we just are like, hey, obviously you can't do Jira. So tell me what you did today via an email. Tell me what you did today on this Google Doc. So, I still have something concrete, but I can still track it and I can still do the things that I need to do with metrics. If you guys have specific circumstances that you want me to kind of reference or talk about, Bernie's going to put my information up at the end. Feel free to book an appointment with me. I'm happy to talk about it and just walk you through some things. Because like I said, I know that can get really personalized very quickly.
We had another question from Alexandra. She asked, can we talk a little bit about the process to modify accommodations?
In terms of modifying accommodations, I still believe in that access strategy where we should have a document or a pathway for somebody to send an email to a point person, be like, hey, I need to modify it. I need to change it, that kind of thing. If you have something in place, if you don't have a process in place, but somebody has an accommodation, that gets a little tricky. but you can incorporate your managers into that. You'll have to train your managers a little bit again for some soft skills, right? But they should be able to say to their manager, hey, this is my accommodation. I need to have a meeting to modify it or to change it because my needs have changed. And then they can pull in human resources and actually have like a little conference or whatnot to go through that process. So modifying accommodations is fine. People should modify them or change, our things change as we grow, as we, mature, as we become a little older, a little bit more seasoned at the end of the day. And so changing those accommodations, there should be a pathway. It just depends on what you currently have. So if you have something that's pretty decent, HR handles most of them, make sure you have a point person for people to reach out to and say, hey, I need to modify this. And you can go through the rest of it of what does that modification look like? What do you need? What can we do on our end? Something that somebody said, and I just saw it, was about legal docs. It's creepy. Like legal letters, medical letters, you guys have to be very careful about these things. Because you can, since we're talking about neurodivergent folks and people who have visible disabilities, I want you to think of it this way. By law, you can request medical documentation if the disability is not visible. I know some of us probably have a very strong reaction to that, and I feel it. But if the disability is not visible, the company can request that information. However, you have to be very, very careful with this. You cannot request excessive information. You can't demand that they give you like a full medical, a specific diagnosis. You cannot go into that. It really should just be a doctor, a real one that you look up and is, completely valid, saying, hey, they need this accommodation for whatever X reason. But you cannot request, that they have a specific diagnosis of autism or ADHD or anything like that to get what they're requesting. That becomes highly illegal. In addition to that, once you get that information, it needs to be completely separate from their personnel file. HIPAA, ADA demands that. So yes, excessive documentation really is a problem because people don't understand they can't request that, and employees don't understand that they don't have to send that. So that's the kind of stuff that people really do get in trouble with about. And I'm like, you cannot ask those people those questions. You will get sued. So in terms of the medical documentation, yes, you as a HR, what have you, can ask that. Perfectly legal to ask that, perfectly legal to request that information, but you cannot push for, well, this isn't enough because I don't see a diagnosis. This isn't enough because of that. You cannot do that. You can actually get sued for that. Great question, Brett.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just a follow-up question on that, because I feel like even some doctors don't realize this, right? Like, I feel like sometimes doctors will write the diagnosis of them, and it's just like, we don't need this information, right? Like, so like what I'm trying to figure out is because at this company that I'm at currently, they don't really have like a formal process in place. I feel like I need to start advising employees for like neurodivergent cases, like please have your doctor just say the accommodation, do not include your diagnosis, right? Like kind of give them like more detailed instructions so that way we don't get in between those fine lines.
Yes. And to me, you are right on track.
Thank you.
Because yes, you are valid. I hear that. Because doctors don't understand that. You would be surprised how many people in healthcare don't necessarily understand that. But when you're advising employees, absolutely tell them, I just need the accommodation. I don't necessarily need the diagnosis. And that's all it has to be. And you can explain it's to protect the privacy. Now, even with that being said, this is a place where if you have like a standardized, document for people to use, it can help even more because you can essentially create not just, an accommodations request sheet. You can request or rather create a small packet, couple of pages of paper or, what have you that actually explain what their rights are, what they do have to have, what the process looks like, what it should look like, how that goes. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then I know because we're almost at time, I have one more question for you. Because like I'm getting more exposure to this side of accommodations, right? Like the neurodivergent side of things. And it's like, I've noticed with managers, right? Like they're very green. It's like when they have a situation where somebody has a neurodivergent case, right? Like there was one recently with somebody had ADHD, like they just voluntarily shared this with the manager and then myself, right? Like just went super into detail and I was like, oh my God. But like I appreciate the transparency, but like they both just didn't know what was going on. So it's like I'm glad I was like looped in, but like what ended up happening is like this employee was having performance issues, but they weren't set up in a situation that helped accommodate them, right? And it's like the manager moves forward with terminating them. I wasn't involved in this, but it's like, you know what I struggle with? It's like this person just started, like, I guess like my question is like, when a situation like that arises, right? Like, what should be the guidance for a manager about like give them at least 30 days with this accommodation at the very minimum, right? To see kind of like how they do.
Yes. For that, the guidance specifically would be if you know that there is a condition, if you know that there's neurodivergence going on, if they have expressed that to you, you cannot just go through the paper trail. You do need to have in your performance reviews, because they're supposed to have those, right? They're supposed to have one-on-ones, they're supposed to have that communication in those meetings. You need to kind of go into, is there some way that we can support you more in this area? That's also where I know people aren't doing a ton of things right now, but that's also where maybe some good, just old fashioned leadership training and management training on neurodivergence and what those things can look like would also be useful, so that people can kind of have an idea of, okay, this may be happening. So let me now take X and go to Y in my one-on-ones. And I don't have to ask them if they have a diagnosis. That's not what I have to do. But I can make suggestions based off of what I know and what I'm familiar with that might support this person, and asking those questions of how can we accommodate you? How can we support you? That goes back to leadership development, if I'm being honest with you, because that means that leadership person doesn't have the ability at that point, the capability to have that kind of real conversation with that employee. They haven't bridged that gap.
It is very rough out here. Thank
It's
you.
rough in these streets.
Yes, very. Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. This is the best webinar I've joined on accommodations in the last like 5 years. Like I have learned
I
so
feel
much.
good about myself. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
seriously, thank you so much. This was incredible.
Thank you, Cree. Thank you. All right, everyone. Well, we are at time, and obviously we want to make sure to respect everyone's time for today. Thank you so very much for joining, Rebecca. Fantastic job. I mean, I don't have to say it, Creedy just did. Really, really well done. So those of you who are still here, if you have further questions, want to chat more in depth with Rebecca about how she can potentially help in your organization with accommodations, don't hesitate to reach out to her. With that, please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye.